Starship, and that the control bridge was the Arrowwing Wave Rider thing. It's also interesting to note that all disc vehicles, all trianguloid vehicles, all Arrowwing vehicles, all Batarang vehicles that are moving in the air column at sufficient speed, they seem to have multiple modes of propulsion. In other words, you fly through an atmosphere differently than you fly through a hydrosphere, which is under a lake, under the ocean, under the water. But once you leave an atmosphere, in order to escape the gravity well, you switch to something else. Because in an atmosphere, if the Roswell spaceship's skin was its engine, then the only concept that works is something called magneto-aeroelectrodynamics. What that means is that electromagnetic fields functioning from nose to tail and from leading edge of wing to trailing edge of wing cause electrons, agitated electrons in the atmosphere, agitated atoms in the atmosphere, agitated molecules in the atmosphere to move over the wing camber to where, and camber means you've got more of a curve on top and much less of a curve underneath, which is how you get lift in an atmosphere or underwater. This would move the air fast. And if you have morphable camber like a bird does with its wings, then the thing could steer conventionally with the same degree of precision as a Shrike or something smaller than a Peregrine Falcon, but even a Peregrine Falcon. Your vehicle would be agile in the air. And then when it dives into the ocean, like the flying submarine from Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, now its skin is doing what's called magneto-hydrodynamics. And there's been a lot of technology experimented with going all the way back to the 70s of using magnetic fields to make water flush through a tube fast to form a more silent version of propulsion than one would get from a propeller, even if you have your blades bent at the right precision of degrees, even if you have a cowl around it, which helps the water channel even better while producing less churning noise. But still, magneto-hydrodynamics underwater for your USOs, magneto-aeroelectrodynamics in atmosphere. But what do you do in a vacuum? Well, Hal Puthoff's favorite answer would be zero-point energy, scalar, otherwise known as the engineering of vacuum. Because vacuum is not empty. It's full of roiling energy that if it can be channeled between veins, structures, or even fields, you can go very fast. You won't be able to break the speed of light, but you might attain Einsteinian velocities. Now, how do you know when you're hitting Einsteinian velocity? When you're sitting in your spaceship and you're slowly accelerating, meanwhile on Earth your wife is aging way faster than you are.
Okay. Bill, can you comment on the flight control system?
Flight control systems, all right. This is real good. Now remember, he's going to be inserting all kinds of drawings. There's 22 of them. There was 7 seats, front to back. You had 2 almost like pilots side by side. Within their wraparound consoles that were push button, they would literally type commands of some sort on a panel that was interactive with these tiny little suction cups, most closely similar to the underside of a starfish's arm, or what you find underneath a sea urchin after you turn him over. Something that's very much the function, structure, and form of an echinoderm, if you had that on your fingerprints, which they did. 4 fingers, no thumbs. The guy on the starboard side, the right side, the pilot in command, just like in a helicopter, he had a joystick that was fitted to his 4 fingers. So he had a joystick, just like old computer games in arcades, and he flew that joystick to the side, which is also similar to the flight control stick for your F-16, which is also on the side. So they had screens. They were also sitting behind, directly behind the root end of that thumbnail-like canopy that I call the forward sensor array shield. Now remember, when the spaceship crashed into the rocks, it didn't break apart into a lot of pieces. The gash had been caused by the lightning strike, and the thing had fluttered out of the sky, leaking all of those fluids, making it like a losing power leaf. It fluttered. If the power fields came back on and snapped on and off and on and off for seconds, it's possible that the portion that gouged the ground on the Foster Ranch in Corona, it's quite possible that what ended up happening was a force field that does breakthrough propulsion physics would have some interesting characteristics. You would weigh virtually nothing, but your mass goes to almost infinity. So if you're traveling at the speed of, say, 110 knots, which is the landing speed of an F-18, and if an F-18 is coming in on an aircraft carrier and it's at 110 knots and it drops its tail hook, it's hoping that arresting cable is going to get it because it needs at least 110 knots, according to the NATOPS flight manual, to take off again for another go-round. Well, if it hits the deck and crashes, everything's in a gazillion little pieces and the pilot is a burnt smear. Or something close. So whatever caused that gouge was probably still traveling roughly at 110 knots when it hit the ground and ran for 1.5 miles. The gouge. With its debris.
Okay.
Disintegration.
Back to the debris really quickly, Bill. What other type of debris was at the debris field?
Large chunks of rigid metal, smaller sheets of memory metal that crumple and would come back. Then you had your I-beams with the writing on it. You had circular hoops. You had all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. It was wreckage. Some of it was rigid, some of it was semi-rigid. All of it was of metal that you couldn't drill with diamonds, and basically the only way to cut into it was with a laser. And even a laser, it would resist for a while.
Bill, is it your professional assessment that to this day there are still locals at Roswell that have debris?
Well, I would say their children or their grandchildren.
Okay.
Have you looked at the rates of dementia and Alzheimer's and everything else? 1947, do the math. How far back was that?
80 something.
Damn near. Some people would hang on to it, some people would throw it away. There may still be debris in the dirt. And of course, the way the winds blow out there, some of that debris could be all the way to Kansas by now.
But isn't it true that the civilians got to the debris field before the military, and they picked up souvenirs, and it was handed down through the family?
Quite possibly.
Okay.
If it was my family, absolutely.
I mean, so someone could theoretically go there. I don't know how you would find these people, but there are still people who live in Roswell who have debris, who have material.
Roswell's the third largest city in New Mexico, and it's home of, I think, the largest actual rodeo in the United States. Mm-hmm. It's a huge farm town. That said, the actual residents who were born and raised there,
yeah, and
whose alma mater is Roswell High School, to include Demi Moore, they're very closed off to outsiders, just like people who live around Loch Ness are. Mm-hmm. I've encountered people that won't talk to you unless they know you're from Roswell,
okay,
or the surrounding ranches and farms. It's always been that way. I know that I thoroughly messed up a real estate deal because some of the Roswell residents wanted to move the crash site to a place more convenient to build a massive golfing resort, vacation resort area, and create kind of a theme park. Max Littell, he's probably dead now. He was definitely one of the ones that was involved in that. Boy, did he hate my guts.
Bill, what about Mac Brazel's brother, Bill Brazel, right?
I never met him.
What did he recover?
I don't remember.
You don't remember?
I don't.
Okay.
Do you?
Well, he had a quote unquote cigar box of material, and he let that slip, and then the military came in and upturned the floorboards. Yep, and took it.
Okay, thank you for reminding me. It's been a long time. Then Don Schmidt talks about what? Something like a flight box?
A cigar box with a couple of scraps
and bits. Is this the same box?
No. This is a cigar box full of little scraps of debris
Gotcha.
that he kept.
Right.
And he had to give it back.
Yeah, in the movie Paul Davids did, it was Jesse Marcel's son, Jesse Marcel Jr., Colonel Jesse Marcel Jr. of the Montana Air National Guard.
Right.
At 70 years old, was flying combat missions in Iraq.
Yeah, that's pretty good, huh?
And then he died.
Yeah.
I don't remember the date. Jesse Marcel Jr. was a gentleman, and he treated me and my wife with courtesy. Did not know him well. Only met him a couple of times.
Right.
Colonel Corso, interestingly enough, endorsed the Tester model kit presentation of the Roswell UFO. Stan Friedman was very courteous and very, I would not say supportive, but he was very courteous, and he was he was very kind in the manner in which he treated me personally, and my wife the one time he met her. But Corso was the best. Mm-hmm. Now, again, what did they find on Brazel's land? A whole bunch of stringy-looking glass pipe things that we would identify nowadays as something like fiber optic at a time when that didn't exist. There was also associated with the seats in the spacecraft,
Okay.
these tiny little hook-like tendrils that were very similar to tiny, tiny versions of sea anemones, you know, from the tide pools, a sea anemone, a relative of a coral or a hydra, that would grab the fiber from the flight suits, functioning like Velcro inside the Apollo space capsule,
Right.
functioning like it would be way better than a seat belt,
Yeah.
because
The
if
load distribution.
if they recline and their hands are here and there's an neurodynamic contact through the fingertips and maybe a contact through the headrest, and they're sitting like this, their wraparound console, it's a crash couch, a cockpit seat, and a control panel all merged into one unit that also holds the being in a seat with a 10,000 years in advance concept that Velcro copied. Now, think about this. Two guys in front with the four fingers.
Right.
The next pair behind them sat facing a Bell Dome reactor that was no bigger than this. It was like half of a sphere that merged directly with the floor, and from which a perfectly round cylinder waveguide went straight up to the ceiling right about here and expanded into the ceiling, which then just went down like this.
Okay.
And then there was vents right here where the fluid would come back in after its journey through the floor, and the scrubbers.
I have to ask you, Bill, where did we get the information for the half spherical dome with the waveguide? Where did we get that information
Frank
from?
Kaufman
Frank
and
Kaufman?
Richard Tungate.
Okay, they both told you they saw that? Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, the two most nefarious witnesses did tell me that. And as a detective, people don't always tell the truth. But plenty of times, especially when they're near death, they'll tell you portions of the truth. Because they got to tell you some truth. Because the urge to confess is usually never greater than when the Reaper's 15 minutes away and you have that last moment of clarity where the pain medication no longer works and you're gutting through the worst agony of your life, and you have total clarity, even if you were suffering from some form of dementia or even an Alzheimer's situation.
Was that the case with Frank Kaufman? Did he have a deathbed confession statement?
According to Don Schmidt, who says he was there, yeah.
Yeah.
He basically confirmed at the moment of his death that everything he'd said about the vehicle and the flight crew was true.
Okay.
Now that makes sense. You see, those guys come from a generation that couldn't make this shit up. They had already seen this stuff before the first zombie movies ever appeared. I mean, true horror did not exist until the late 60s. That's when you started to get special makeup effects for slasher films and mayhem and zombies, you know, George Romero and his Night of the Dead. Then you had those guys over in Europe that were making that stuff too. All of it featured in the earliest issues of Fangoria magazine. But again, you had these two guys
Right.
reclined with their consoles,
Okay.
staring right at the reactor. In other words, forward was on the left and aft was on the right for one guy on the port side, and the opposite for the other guy on the starboard side.
Okay, so we've got the two up front, we've got the reactor, and then in back of the reactor, we've got another two, correct?
In back of the reactor, you have another two, but they're facing toward the tail.
They're facing towards, so they're
Their
aft
backs.
they're aft facing.
They're aft facing.
Okay, now what's behind them?
What we think is the captain.
What we think is the captain.
He's in his own cocoon-like niche inside of the crew cabin, which is like a cocoon.
So that's 5 right now, right? That's 5?
Right.
Okay.
And this captain guy, he was the hardest one to get out because he was way back there. And it's so tiny. Basically, you're in, a grown man is crawling around basically in a width no bigger than a crawl space under a house.
Now he's sitting forward, right?
He's facing forward, but his head is literally enveloped in a metal crystalline, but soft, soft like beanbag chair soft, that covers the crown of his head. And the best way to describe it is it's a cervix.
Okay.
And his head's sticking in the back like a cervical, like a probe that's trying to penetrate into a cervical structure. And he's got a view screen here that kind of comes down like this. He could still see all the way forward to beyond the pilots what's going on down there.
Right.
And he has a complete wraparound console that's completely cocooned him. But here's the kicker. Only the two guys in the front had 4 fingers. The rest of them had thumbs.
Okay.
They had thumbs. 5-fingered hands with little tiny sea urchin-like tentacle cups, stretchy tentacle cups.
Now what about the other 2? Where did they fit in?
Don't know.
Don't know.
Those bodies were probably in no shape to really help. We probably could tell the difference between soft tissue and cartilage.
Okay, so you think they were just aft in the craft itself? Not in any seats, they were just hanging out?
Yeah. Now, let's talk cause of death. Depending on which flight crew member it was, they died one of 3 ways, or by a combination of all 3. Blunt force trauma, because if you're inside a giant water balloon, but if you throw it hard enough against the wall, and you got like some kind of little fish or bug inside, the force of the impact and the splash will still kill the fish or the bug.
Okay.
So that's one way they died. Another way was extreme and very rapid dehydration, because their physiology appeared, and this is going to get interesting, and this comes from Len Stringfield, by the way. This is really going to knock your socks off. The physiology of these things was such that there's a species of these tiny African frogs that we generally populate our African fish tanks with, you know, our African tropical freshwater fish tanks. And there's these little frogs. Their lungs are vestigial as well. They breathe through their skin. Water, the oxygen transfers in through the skin from the water, and CO2 transfers out because there's little tiny blood vessels right at the surface of the skin of these little frogs. So respiration is simply automatic. There is no inhalations or exhalations. And they spend their entire lives, for the most part, underwater. These things existed in a fluid. That fluid functioned as the other part of the seatbelt contraption, in that if you're laid back and the Velcro, and this is a molecular metal crystalline recipe of material that is intelligently latching into the fibers of your jumpsuit, and it's holding you there, and you got all this water there, that when your ship is turning and weaving and flitting around in the skies over New Mexico, And there was many of them, and Frank Kaufman was watching them on radar for the better part of 72 hours before the crash retrieval.
Okay.
But that water fluid, you know what the forces of inertia are, and you know as a pilot what it feels like if you get in a fighter jet and they take you for a really fast ride and flip you all around. Well, if your environment was a fluid, a lot of that discomfort would be cushioned, because water makes a great cushion against inertia. Unless you crash at a speed that causes a big old splash, and since you're 75% water in your body, you and me, there comes a point where if we're falling fast enough and we hit the ground, we make a big splash too.
Okay, that leads to another question, Bill. Was there a second body site?
According to Don Schmidt and Tom Carey, there was. I never got to investigate that.
Okay, all right.
I believe that that would account for the 2 missing bodies that were not found within or in the vicinity of the vehicle. One body was sitting upright with an perfectly angelic expression, an angelic expression of innocence on its face.
Okay, but all 7 dead, correct? No survivors?
Based on everything that our 11 colleagues gleaned from all of the shared witnesses and based on the unshared witnesses that I had, nothing survived.
Okay, now here's the question, Bill. How do we rectify that with a statement by Marion Black Magruder, who stated that he saw the Roswell survivor in April of 1948 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base? How do we rectify that?
Well, wasn't it January of 47 that there was another crash somewhere else?
Well,
wasn't there the possibility of an Aztec, New Mexico crash before Magruder saw anything?
that was in 48, so
And
that
so
would
was
have been
Magruder.
March. Well, yeah, but there was no survivors there at Aztec.
Okay, so
He claims to have seen the survivor through a one-way mirror.
okay, then there's the Timmensdorfer, West Germany crash in 1962. Year I was born. In fact, I'm 1 month older than the A-12 going operation. But 12 bodies recovered from a vehicle that was disassembled into as many pieces as there are slices of a pie. In Timmensdorfer, West Germany, by a British recovery team in 1962, that Bob Dean read all of the reports about in shock headquarters, at SHAPE headquarters,
Yeah.
first in France and later Belgium.
Okay. So you think he saw something?
Best guess, there were 11 crashes,
Yeah.
1 or 2 possible survivors. And to be honest with you, I've never believed in more than one survivor. And how long did that survivor survive?
He said it was alive until we killed it. So they did some experiment on it and they killed it.
Okay, well now that gets us to Bob Uhouse. Remember Bob Uhouse?
Yes, I do.
In, what was it, Blue Diamond, Nevada? Yeah, he didn't live much further away from Art Bell, did he? Bob Uhouse described the J-Rod.
Bill Uhouse, right?
Bill Uhouse.
Yeah.
Bill, Bob. So many Bills and Bobs in this community, ain't there? No, Bill Uhouse, he described the J-Rod, extraterrestrial biological entities. And he said that their cranium was slightly bifurcated and that they could communicate telepathically. He also said several interesting things about the consequences of time travel. Uhouse believed that these guys was a version of us from the future.
Okay.
And being the father of a kid with autism, who's now a young adult with autism, and having observed a lot of autistic people between that 2020 or 2021 interview that I did with Art Bell for the better part of 5 hours, where we compared alien greys to certain types of morphologies of people that were being born now, and playing with the time traveler theory that Jeremy Kagan, who directed and co-executive produced the Roswell movie that I worked on as an illustrator, concept artist. They call me concept designer in the credits. My name in the credits is right there next to Kevin and Don.
Shouldn't they have used your craft in that movie, Bill?
I attempted that.
What happened there?
Jeremy Kagan had no interest. He wanted pods, including the acorn craft.
Okay.
And he wanted, it was a hell of a sales pitch, but instead of giving him a bigger version of a craft or a womb, I gave him a semi-blunted arrowhead, kind of roundish shape that popped into my mind creatively, and Jeremy loved it. So one version of my spaceship is that. The next version, click, 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 click in the movie, that sequence.
I know.
Where they're talking at the pool and some...
Such a good movie.
I know.
Such a...
And then the acorn version, click, 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 click.
Mm-hmm.
And then an earlier version, which was just debris. Those are mine.
Okay.
And as put in by, I can't remember, it started with an A. They were the guys that did the special effects for that sequence. And they did such a damn good job of taking my drawings. But the best part was the matte painting at the end of the movie when Martin Sheen was discussing this entire thing with Kyle MacLachlan as Jesse Marcel Sr. in 1977 during his old age. And they show that matte painting inside hangar 18 or 81 or 84, whatever it was, with that big old giant disc with the dark obsidian belly and silvery top.
That's your drawing. I know. I know it is. Yes.
You'll be able to add to this
Yes.
tape all of the original images that were used for developing the spaceships and the bodies.
Right.
Steve Johnson of XFX actually did the aliens, and as Jeremy said, they're an amalgamation of everything you told us, Bill.
Okay. Just for the sake of what we're talking about, give me some general dimensions of the craft, Bill.
I've said this before.